everyone. Welcome to week 4 of performance management. We are covering chapter 6 this week, so you do get a little bit of a break in that there's not quite as much content. And so I wanted to begin with just a little bit of a review, basically a snapshot of kind of what we've learned so far. So up until this point, we've talked a lot about the purpose of performance management and why it's needed. We talked about the need for it to align with the strategic purpose of the organization. So what we're asking our employees to do and how we're evaluating that performance needs to align with our overall strategic goals and organizational objectives. And then from there, we have to be able to very clearly define job performance and understand what we mean by performance. And we do that by focusing on either measuring behaviors or measuring results. So this graphic here is just a quick snapshot of what we mean when we say measuring results, what it would look like. So here we would have different task clusters would be used to create accountabilities. From those accountabilities, we would have very specific objectives, right? Have to be measurable and specific. And then associated with each objective, we would have performance standards to know whether or not we've captured minimum performance or even maximum performance. On the other hand, we can also evaluate behaviors, and so behaviors are assessed more with competencies. So these competencies are created by looking at clusters of KSAs, which are knowledge, skills, and abilities. So what knowledge, skills, and abilities are needed, those lead to certain competencies. And then if we want to evaluate competencies, we would create these indicators, right? These key performance indicators, and we would be able to evaluate those either in a, using comparative or absolute methods to assess. So whether we're comparing performance to others in order to come up with a rating, or if we're giving absolute, just individual focused ratings. So it's a nice, I think, just summary to kind of bring you up to speed on where we are. If we could really summarize what we've talked about so far this semester, these two graphics do a good job of indicating that. So this week, what we are focusing on are performance analytics. And I want to preface this by saying that we are not doing any kind of statistical analysis in this class. The purpose of the analytics, so to speak, is not to teach you how to really perform in terms of calculating ratings or, having formulas or anything like that, but just to give you an understanding of where data comes from. So if we are going to evaluate employees, where do we get the data? And what are different approaches to trying to make sense of that data. So if you're expecting any kind of numbers this week, you won't find them in this chapter because the approach is really just to talk through what to do with the data or how we collect it. So here's our agenda in terms of chapter 6. So we're going to talk about how to design an appraisal form, talk about the different touch points of who might provide this data for the appraisal forms. We're going to talk about rater accuracy and why individuals may or may not accurately rate other people. And then there are two different approaches to combining data. So if we consider all the information we get from the appraisal forms as data, then we can go about combining that data in different ways. And then lastly, the appraisal period and meetings. So we're going to talk about how to conduct these different meetings. And while generally speaking, we think of having one performance appraisal meeting, there's actually 6 different purposes of the appraisal meeting. We tend to try to cover all of those things at one time, which can kind of muddy the water in terms of trying to develop employees and also trying to tie our ratings back to compensation. And so we're going to talk through what those different meetings look like and how they should be separated out in time. So the performance appraisal form is really what we're going to use to capture all of the data to try to put into a formal standard sheet or form how our employees are doing. So there should be some basic shared information that all good performance appraisal forms would include. So the first is just basic employee information. So obviously this makes sense when we need to know their job title and their department, their ID number or anything like that if they have one, their pay grade or salary. the evaluation period, their start date, the reason for the appraisal, and the next appraisal date. So generally speaking, I think organizations cover most of this information, but the reason for the appraisal is important, and we'll talk about that when we get to the different components of the appraisal process. But then also the next appraisal dates that the employee can anticipate the next time that we're going to be meeting to discuss their performance. Should also include their developmental achievements. So here it's really important to highlight things that the employee has had a chance to do since the last time you met with them. So what are some new skills that they learned, maybe conferences that they attended or different certifications they may have achieved. So any attempt that they made to enhance their knowledge, skills, or abilities should be included and really highlighted on this form. We should also have a section for developmental needs and plans. So looking at how our employees are doing and identifying ways in which they can continue to strengthen their skills, or if there is a deficit in skills or knowledge, identifying how we will go about filling that gap. So here it's identifying the ways in which we expect our employee to continue to grow with a very clear plan outlined for how they can do that. A good appraisal form will also have multiple touch points. So what this means is that we will have collected ratings and evaluations of the employee from multiple different sources. So this could come from a supervisor, it could come from the direct reports, it could come from a customer, and also can come from the employee themselves. So multiple touch points should be included to ensure that we're really assessing employee performance in a 360 way. There should also be a section for employee comments, and I think this is really important and probably a place that's overlooked, but it's important to document the ways in which employees react to or comments they might have regarding the performance appraisal, just so that we can track how they feel about it. It's important to take into account their reactions, particularly if they disagree with something that's been stated or if they want to dispute an action that might result from the performance appraisal. So again, just mentioning, when we have a results-focused system, we would have a section for accountability, objectives, and standards, and we would assess the extent to which those performance standards have been met or exceeded. Did they, in fact, obtain the objective that they set out to? And in a behavior-focused system, we would have the competencies and the behavioral indicators that assess those competencies. So here we would be saying, did they demonstrate fulfillment of those competencies by performing these certain behavioral indicators during the appraisal time period. So on the prior slide, we talked about all the things that a good performance appraisal form would have, but there are also desirable characteristics of a performance appraisal form. And so these should, it's important to note there isn't just one universal form, right? It's going to be tailored to the specific job context, workplace context, different industries, depending on if you're using results or behavior focus, or maybe you're merging the two together to assess different types or dimensions of job performance. So really these forms should be thoughtfully created in order to really align with the job at hand. But regardless of what the form looks like, there are some key characteristics that are helpful in creating an efficient and effective form. And it's also important to note that you might have multiple forms. So we should have a form for when we're doing check-ins. So it's important to document what we're saying to our employees, even if we're meeting in an informal way, particularly if we're giving some developmental feedback or expecting them to follow up with a change in behavior or a change in results. If we have a development-focused meeting, which oftentimes we don't separate out development from performance appraisal, but we should. If we have a meeting just sitting down to talk about development opportunities, we should document that. When the formal appraisal occurs, we should document that. So all of these forms need to be created per job, right, per context. That way we have a really rich record of these interactions we're having with our employees. So the characteristics of the forms would be simplicity, so these have to be easy to understand and easy to administer. Ideally, they'll be quick to complete as well. So we want the forms to be parsimonious, right? You don't want pages and pages and pages of forms to fill out. It's certainly not going to be doable, particularly in large organizations. We also want the forms to have relevancy, which means they will include information that's specifically relevant to the job. So you don't want someone filling out a form but crossing out 5 sections because it doesn't apply to the job at hand. So we want to make sure that all of those sections are relevant to the job and the context that we're assessing. They should also be descriptive, which means that we should provide a clear understanding of the performance information and how that performance information is conveyed. And so we really want to demonstrate good evidence of performance, that they are descriptive in being able to collect the information that we need to really tell us how an employee is performing. Good forms should also demonstrate adaptability, which means individuals should be able to adapt them to their specific departments or their specific units. So a good form wouldn't be created and only can be used for one very specific job, but hopefully could be able to be adapted to, a similar format across the organization. Forms should also be comprehensive, so this is important that we're assessing all areas of performance and not just one area of performance. So we don't want to hone in on just task performance, which I think is a mistake that a lot of organizations make, but is there space to assess for those other dimensions of performance like citizenship behavior, counterproductive work behaviors, etc. A good form will also provide definitional clarity, which means that we are going to explain or define very clearly each of the competencies that we might be trying to assess, or that the results are clearly defined so that a rater can go through the form and know very specifically what's being assessed and how we're going to determine whether or not that performance has been demonstrated. Should also be include good elements of communication, so the form itself should not be confusing. We should understand what's happening in the process. Anybody who reads it or anyone who's involved in the process should have a good understanding of what's occurring. So the form just needs to be clear, needs to have good directions so that everyone involved can be on the same page. And then lastly, we need to have a consideration of time orientation. So this means that a good form is not just focused on documenting what's happened in the past, but also has a space created to talk about what the future might hold. So as evaluating performance feedback shouldn't focus on what has happened, because we have to document what an employee did or the results that they created, but we also need to account for how they might continue to improve or what the future looks like for them in terms of a developmental standpoint. So all of these characteristics are going to be important in creating a performance appraisal form that meets these standards. So as we mentioned, performance appraisal should include data from multiple touch points. So again, when we're talking about data analytics, where are we going to get data from? Typically speaking, I think we assume that the supervisor is providing ratings, but there are lots of different sources that we can use, or what we would call touch points. So we might ask the supervisor, of course, this is the person overseeing the employees and their feedback is important, but they're probably not able to view all of the employees' performance or their behaviors day to day. Supervisors are engaged in their own work and they might miss a lot of information, particularly if a supervisor is not present when the employee is working. So thinking about some jobs where there's second shift or third shift work occurring. Peers provide another touch point. So here we need to identify individuals who work with the employee and if they're able to provide feedback on that person's performance. But it is necessary to note that there is a thing called friendship bias, which can occur when we want to help out our friends and we want them to succeed. And so we might be willing to state that they're a good employee or that they're performing well, even if they're not. But oftentimes, peers often lack this ability to discriminate performance, so they're not really trained in performance evaluation, and therefore they might just give positive ratings to everybody in their work group, or not, there won't be a lot of variability in the ratings that they give. So for this reason, it's helpful to get insight on some of those behaviors that might not be quite as noticeable to the supervisor, like citizenship behaviors or counterproductive work behaviors, but peers really shouldn't provide the sole source of data for a performance appraisal. We can also assess the direct reports of an employee. So this is really helpful because employees can provide insight on how they think their supervisor is performing, and if there, are weaknesses or areas of concern, or even things that are being done really well. Now, given some of the power dynamics and the hierarchical nature of organizations, using this direct report information is helpful for developmental purposes related to a supervisor. So this insight can be really good on identifying places where the supervisor might need to continue to develop their skills, particularly related to leadership or project management. But because of those power dynamics, it's really important that these ratings are kept confidential. We don't want anybody to retaliate because they fear or they sense that they got a negative review from a particular employee. So confidentiality is quite key. We can also ask customers for feedback on how our employees are doing. So these could be internal or external clients. If you work within an organization, but you do some consulting or you assist with another department, it'd be quite helpful to ask them. Or if you work in a service industry where you directly interact with clients, asking those clients about their satisfaction is important. These are less frequently used, even though kind of associated with the output or end goal or organizational objectives. So it's really helpful information to get, but can be quite time consuming to try to track down people to complete those evaluation forms. And then probably most important here is to also include self-rating, so allowing the employee opportunity to rate how they think they're doing. This provides a good benchmark to see how the employee views themselves compared to how a supervisor or others might view themselves. If there's a gap or a discrepancy, we can talk about it. Asking for self-evaluations also is instrumental in trying to get acceptance and buy-in from employees. So when they feel like they've had a chance to have some voice or some say in the process, they're much more likely to be committed to the process. Though when evaluating ourselves, sometimes we're not as objective as we need to be, and this can lead to leniency and biases in our ratings of ourselves. But again, self-evaluations probably not going to be used to make determinations about pay raises or promotions, but can be a really important developmental tool. So as we mentioned on the prior page, there are lots of opportunities for bias to be introduced into the appraisal process, in part because raters might be differentially motivated. So in some instances, individuals might not be motivated to provide accurate ratings, and this is based on a few things. The first is whether or not the outcomes will be positive or negative. And so if an employee knows that their evaluation could lead to some very positive outcomes for someone they like, they might be influenced to inflate those ratings. On the contrary, if they think that negative outcomes could ensue for someone that they might like, they might deflate their ratings, or they might inflate their ratings because they want to, protect that person or shield that person from negative outcomes. And so, unfortunately, though we want our raters to be motivated to provide accurate ratings, there are reasons why they might not. So when we think about why managers might be motivated to inflate employee ratings, so here, this is somebody who is, giving someone a higher score or a higher rating than they might deserve or might be reflected in an objective evaluation. There are lots of reasons why. So maybe they want to maximize the merit raise and rewards for that employee. So they think that person is a good employee overall, and they really want them to have the opportunity to get everything that they could get as a result of the appraisal process. In some instances, an employee is really terrible, but we say that they're great because we're hoping to promote them out of our unit so that we don't have to work with them anymore, which might seem counterintuitive, but hey, you want to get that person out, and you do that by just saying how great they are to try to convince someone else to take the employee on. We might also use these ratings to encourage employees. So sometimes individuals get negative performance feedback, and it can be demotivating to them. So on the contrary, we might try to use these to keep, build some self-confidence, to build some self-efficacy, and to hopefully spur performance out of people who might kind of be stuck in the middle. We might also want to avoid filling out paperwork and having to create any kind of written record. And so, oftentimes documenting poor performance is really challenging. It's time consuming. It can lead down, a lot of rabbit holes related to legal requirements. And so managers just are normal people with limited time, and they don't want the headache of having to do all that. So just saying somebody's, above average kind of gets them out of the problem zone without really needing you to do extra work. It can also make the manager look good. If all of your employees look as though they're like top performers, they're doing really great work, that looks like you are leading a great team, and then you can use that to your own advantage to move up through the organization. And lastly, some individuals are just really bad at confrontation, or they don't know how to give feedback. And so anytime they have to give feedback, they view it as a conflict, when really it doesn't have to be that way. So instead of having those difficult conversations and trying to navigate that terrain, they just inflate ratings, and it kind of saves them from having to have those uncomfortable conversations with individuals about their performance. On the other hand, managers might be motivated to deflate employees' ratings. So here they give somebody a lower rating than they actually deserve. So maybe in some cases they do it to shock an employee. If somebody, could improve, but they want them to kind of be fearful and to, realize, hey, I've got a lot on the line here. They might give them a lower rating than normal just to shock them into, performing. Maybe they want to teach the employee a lesson, or try and force the employee out. So if it's someone you really don't like, you don't want to work with, you say, here are these really terrible ratings, and then maybe that convinces the employee they want to go somewhere else. You might also give poor ratings to help build a strong record of documentation. So if you have someone who's been a problem performer in the past and you do want them to be out of the organization, and you need to have a track record in order to be able to legally show that they've been problematic, you might lower the ratings than what they actually deserve to help with that case. And of course, personal biases or strained relationships can be a problem here. So if there's someone that you don't like, or you've had a conflict with, or are known to actively be feuding with, certainly that can influence how you would evaluate them. So there are lots of different things that we can do to try to increase rater accuracy, and this is a really important area for organizations to focus on, because our performance evaluations are really only as good as the data that we have. So if the data we're collecting on our performance appraisal forms are flawed, if they're biased, then we're not getting detailed, accurate information, and that can hurt the decisions that we're making in terms of who gets promoted or who works within each work group, or even thinking about succession planning. So increasing rater accuracy really should be paramount to an organization's objectives for the year. So one thing that we can do is ask individuals to justify ratings, and do so face-to-face. So when they have to verbalize the reasons why they evaluated somebody a certain way, that can help eliminate them just sort of off the cuff either inflating or deflating a rating. But instead, when they have to justify why they did something, that might spur them to really draw upon available evidence and not just make a decision based on how they feel about somebody. We can also include performance management within a manager's job description. So oftentimes within a job description, we talk about all the tasks that someone needs to complete to do the job, but we don't always specify different leadership characteristics that they might need. And so here we can frame performance management as something that an individual has to do as part of their job. And by doing that, individuals might feel as though they're not just performing some task that has to be, done for the sake of being done, but really that they're fulfilling their own job responsibilities by taking this process seriously. And further, we can evaluate managers on the quality of the ratings that they provide. So we can assess the extent to which they are doing a good job in evaluating their employees. And so by making that kind of one of the competencies that we're assessing of the managers, it might help spur them to be honest and to rely on information and to try to be as rational and as impartial as possible. And then lastly, of course, somewhat of a no-brainer, but we need to train managers how to give feedback. We need to train managers on how to deliver performance appraisal information back to employees. And so by training managers on how to give feedback and how to really assess the information that they're evaluating, we can just improve their overall ability to give accurate ratings.